Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. As it completes 22 months and nears the 2-year mark, many people believe the BJP government is surrounded in controversies. Some would say those controversies are self-made. So how should we view the government? That's the key issue I shall discuss today with a man that many regard as India's most profound political thinker, the President for the Centre for Policy Research, Pratap Bhanu Mehtal. Dr. Mehtal, just over a month ago you wrote, and I'm quoting you, "We are living under a government that is both rabidly malign and politically incompetent. It is using nationalism to crush constitutional patriotism, legal tyranny to crush dissent, political power to settle petty scores, and administrative power to destroy institutions." Now those are very strong words. Is that your view of the government, or are you backing away today from that position?
No, I'm not backing away from that position. I think it is my view of the government, and even if you feel there's a touch of exaggeration in it, I think it can be seen as a warning of about the direction in which the government is going. So I'm not backing down, but certainly there's a pattern of action over the last few months that suggests that the government is sliding down this path.
Give me an idea of the sort of actions that lead you to this conclusion.
There's a number of them, right? So the first and the most obvious one is the arrest of students in JNU on sedition charges. And it wasn't simply the fact that some students were arrested. It's a matter that could have been settled by the courts. But the full firepower, political firepower that the government brought to bear on that issue, you would have thought that this was a national security crisis, the way in which senior ministers jumped into the fray. The parliamentary response, not just to what happened in JNU, but the Rohit Vermula case, suggested a degree of aggression that I think is truly extraordinary. I think one could think most recently, for example, this whole idea of trying to constantly come up with tests of patriotism. So the Bharat Mata controversy, Bharat Mata Ki Jai controversy most recently. Now, there is nothing objectionable in saying Bharat Mata Ki Jai. People should say it spontaneously. But there is something objectionable about a political culture which coerces people into saying it. One can think of, for example, their attitude to what happened in the Patiala courts, where vigilantes were let loose on Kanhaiya Kumar in full gaze of the police, and there still hasn't been an accounting of government for that action. So one can just go on.
Let's pick up on some of those, and let's start with what you wrote when Kanhaiya Kumar was arrested. And you wrote not just with reference to Kanhaiya Kumar, but to the broader developments taking place in JNU. You said, the government does not want to just crush dissent, it wants to crush thinking. That is really strong, isn't it?
It is, well, it is strong, but look, Karan, any society, right, where the government has litmus tests for patriotism, number one, where the government at least turns a blind eye, even if it does not actively collaborate in promoting vigilantism against people who are dissenting and thinking, which promotes a political culture, and frankly the media has actually collaborated in it, where on daily, primetime shows, intellectuals are being hounded, not just name called, but almost as if the media wants to set on vigilante mobs and intellectuals. How do you think thinking is going to be possible in the long run? Across universities in India, I can tell you this, across universities in India, people are thinking twice even about organizing seminars. Government is issuing notifications when giving permission for, let's say, NRIs to do research, which says that one of the conditions of you being able to doing research is that you will not potentially defame India on any international forum. Now, what does that mean? Right? So clearly there is a pattern accumulating here, and this is not just accidental. This is not the zeal of mid-level officials.
This is the government itself.
This is the government itself. You just examine the statement of ministers, senior BJP leaders. Very clearly they have put their weight behind this.
Let's focus for a moment on this government's seeming obsession with anti-nationalism. As you write, being anti-national is not a crime. And secondly, what one man thinks is anti-national could be perfectly acceptable to another. How do you explain to yourself both the government's concern with as well as its persistent focus on anti-nationalism?
Well, I think there are two or three things going on, at least as far as one can speculate. I think the first is, look, when this government came to power, the nature of the BJP and I think the particular history of the Prime Minister, BJP President, one had always supposed that nationalism was actually going to be one of the big themes that are going to play up in Indian politics. And for various reasons, they seem to have decided that this is a trope which can provide a rallying cry and actually isolate their political opponents. And very frankly, you have to see, I mean, when you look at the way in which Congress party has responded, you actually worry that they may be right about this, that ultra-nationalism is a more acceptable trope of aggression and isolating political dissenters in a very subtle way without it being tagged communal and those other things which this party was used to doing.
They may well be getting the opposition to follow their line on ultra-nationalism, but is it striking a chord with the people of India? The BJP does believe it is. But you're an independent assessment. Do you think they're striking a chord with the average, ordinary Aam Aadmi Indian, or are they mistaken?
I think they're mistaken, actually, in the long run. I mean, I think that I think in the immediate context, they probably did manage to deflect attention from a couple of significant political issues facing this country.
Rohit Vemula in particular.
Rohit Vemula in particular. And the reason that issue was politically significant is that the BJP has tried to make inroads into the Dalit constituency. And I think the aggression with which they responded, I don't hold them responsible for Rohit Vemula's death, I think, as some have. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration.
But they mishandled it.
But the nature of their response suggested that they hadn't internalized the basic decencies of how one responds in a situation like this.
You make a further telling point. You write, and again I'm quoting you, if the definition of nationalism is narrow and pinched up, if it does not brook serious criticism, if it is aligned with tyranny, if it trades on an anti-intellectual ignorance, and its purpose is to unleash a frenzy of destructive passion, then in those circumstances, you say, being anti-national might even be an obligation. Are we getting to that sort of position today?
I think we are getting to that sort of position in two ways, right? So number one, look, any nation is going to be strong only if its foundations are based on justice and voluntary compliance. You cannot coerce a nation into being. In fact, whenever, if you look at India's history, state subverting secessionism is often a product of state authoritarianism. And whenever the state has tried democratic incorporation, it has mostly succeeded. And I think that's a big lesson to sort of keep in mind. And if you are in a situation, if you are in social circumstances where a lot of people feel marginalized and oppressed, that kind of state subverting secessionism is going to be an inevitable consequence. So in some senses, by moving the bar on nationalism, by saying that we will coerce people into our version of what it means to celebrate the Indian nation, I'm afraid they are actually risking the very thing that they're out to preserve.
In other words, they're pushing people to be anti-nationalists because that's the only way to oppose their position.
Anti-nationalists by their definition. I mean, I do think we should remember H.L. Mencken's great line that, sometimes people who are very radical in their critiques, actually they're not being anti-national, they just have a very different conception of how you love the nation.
Absolutely, and that's something the BJP doesn't appreciate. They don't see difference as credible and credit-worthy. They see it as opposition, and because it's opposition to them, they see it as anti-national.
There are two things that are going on. One, you're exactly right, which is that they want to polarize the situation by having a simplistic definition of an anti-national. But more importantly, what I'm worried about, right, is that the basic decencies that go into making a society, right, when you see a case like Kanhaiya Kumar's, or when you see a case like Rohit Vemula's, right, the first thing that should strike you is these are extraordinary stories of young men in India. Do you want to live in a society where you set vigilantes on young men like these? Right? No matter what one's position, left or right, national or anti-national.
And young men who are incredible achievers given their birth and circumstances.
Given their birth or circumstances. So what nationalism does, if nationalism colonizes everything, you lose the capacity for creating the space for hearing individual stories. you lose the space for individuality, which is really the foundation of creativity and excellence.
Let me put to you, in the context of all that you said, 2 or 3 test cases. How do you, Pratap, Bhanu, Mehtal, view slogans that say Pakistan Zindabad, Azadi for Kashmir?
So look, my position on the legal matter of this is very clear, which is there has to be a demonstrable and immediate connection between those slogans and violence for them to count as sort of actionable, as it were, by the state.
And if there's no connection?
And if there is no connection, certainly there is no case for either invoking sedition laws or bringing the mighty power of the state to bear on them. I think what you need to do is, in a sense, understand why is it that people are saying this. You can even condemn them, absolutely. I mean, in certain circumstances they are condemnable, they're unnecessary. You can have that debate, but there is a higher threshold of justification that is required for bringing the coercive power of the state to bear on citizens.
What about when you come to 2 other slogans? And these are Kashmir ki azadi tak, Bharat ki barbadi tak, jang ladenge, and Bharat tere tukde tukde honge, inshallah, inshallah.
See, the Kashmir ki azadi thing, to be honest, I think one has to understand the specific history of that slogan. It is pretty much common, as it were, parlance in Kashmir. And very frankly, there are reasons one can understand why people might want to say that, even if one doesn't kind of disagree with them. Now, Bharat ke tukde tukde obviously is incitement in a certain level. In a certain context, can be seen as incitement. It's not something that any one of us would defend. But in the particular context in which was occurred, does it pass the test that it is the kind of slogan where you can show its demonstrable connection with violent subversion of the state?
Again, the answer is no.
Again, the answer is no. In this context, from whatever one can see from the evidence, it's not clear that connection was there. And more importantly, Karan, as you know, the people who were charged with sedition, actually, there's very little evidence that they were the ones actually, chanting these slogans.
Which makes the whole thing more bizarre.
Which makes the whole thing more bizarre, and which makes the whole thing more not about punishing actual culprits, but about sending a signal to everybody.
Very quickly, before I change subject, just to clarify, you have spoken about this a little earlier, but just to clarify, the opposite. Requiring someone, an MLA in Maharashtra in this instance, to say Bharat Mata ki Jai when he's not willing to say it, and then suspending him for failing to say, you think that again is pushing your version of nationalism down someone else's throat, and that person has the right to say what he'll say and what he won't say. It's wrong to suspend. Have I understood that bit correctly?
Absolutely. Saying Bharat Mata ki Jai is something, I think should be celebrated, but requiring that you say it, I think is an extremely dangerous position.
So there's nothing wrong in a man saying, I won't say Bharat Mata ki Jai?
There is actually nothing wrong. There are different ways of loving the country. Maa ka dil banke kabhi seene se lag jata hai tu, kabhi nanni si beti. That's one version of it. And frankly, I will say that there are even circumstances where you don't feel like saying it. I mean, there are circumstances
when your country has embarrassed you,
where the country has embarrassed you. There are circumstances where you actually want to withhold that celebration.
And you have a right to.
And you have a right to.
So far, we've discussed your criticism of the government in terms of what you described in your article 4 weeks ago as its malignancy. Let's now come to your criticism of what you call its political stupidity. You write, and once again I'm quoting you, that the government has shown an utter lack of judgment, where ministers managed to manufacture a national crisis out of minor affectations in student politics. I take it you've written this specifically with regard to what happened in Hyderabad and then what happened in Jawaharlal Nehru University. Who are the ministers you have in mind? And briefly, what are the sort of mistakes and errors they made?
So first, the mistakes and errors, because that's more important. Even the names matter less. So the first mistake is, I think, just in a very immediate context. Look, the Indian voters have consistently rejected the left. This idea that somehow JNU kind of disproportionately dominates how the Indian electorate will think, how Indian democracy functions, I think is a huge exaggeration. And in a sense, you have resurrected I think, intellectual sympathy for the left. Many people have been critics of JNU and the way in which JNU functions. But once you use coercion, you actually make criticism of that institution harder, not easier. So that's a very immediate sort of mistake.
At that point, can I interrupt and say what you're saying is that given the government has an antipathy to JNU, what they've ended up doing, and I'm quoting you, is JNU's importance to national intellectual life had been waning. The government has resurrected it. In other words, this is an own goal. Given that they want to diminish JNU, they've actually built it up.
Absolutely. And they've created JNU now as a focal point for opposition to the government. I think the second and the bigger mistake, which is what, frankly, I'm more worried about in the long run, which is once you unleash this demon of ultranationalism, you actually don't know how the story is going to end. One of the things we know about inciting passions in politics in this kind of way, by holding people to litmus tests, is that frankly we are one accident away, right, from some incident getting out of hand and creating a chain of consequences that the government may not know how to control. Particularly if you insert this kind of aggressiveness in the context, in a very precarious communal context like UP, right? Frankly, a state that is, I think, going to give us nightmares over the next year and a half, right? Once you supercharge the atmosphere with this kind of tension and suspicion, right? We don't know what kinds of subterranean currents it's going to unleash. So who is it going to alienate? And in that sense, the government is taking a big risk, right? The government's job should be to throw cold water over social conflict, not to exacerbate it.
You're saying the government is literally playing with fire. They're holding a matchstick to tinder.
They are holding a matchstick to a situation that is becoming increasingly more combustible. Whereas the government's job is to douse fires. And that's where the role of ministers, right? Whether it was the HRD minister's statement in Parliament, whether it was the Home Minister sort of waxing eloquent about not tolerating anti-nationals. Let's say for argument's sake, you did feel that there was the need for taking action, right? That even in those circumstances, there are settled internal administrative procedures by which that action could have been taken. But when you raise the political ante, as I said, which other national crisis can you think of, Karan, in recent times, where so many high-powered ministers felt the need to be so aggressive in public? You would have thought that we were running after Dawood Ibrahim or something.
In fact, you said something very telling, very powerful and very focused about ministers at that point. I'm going to quote you again. You wrote, "Nothing that the students did poses nearly as much threat to India as the subversion of freedom and judgment this government represents. The Honourable Minister should realize that if this is a debate about nationalism, it is they rather than JNU who should be in the dock. They have threatened democracy. That is the most anti-national of all acts."
I absolutely stand by that statement, because the foundation of a strong nation, if India ceases to be a democracy, it will also cease to be a nation. What keeps us together is the fact that different people feel this is a place in which they can define their identities in whichever way they please. They can define their own relationship to the nation in whichever way they please. We are diverse in our unities. I think unity in diversity has been a misleading slogan. And the minute we take that away from the Indian people, I think we'll cease being a nation. And by cracking down on freedom, that is exactly what this government puts at risk.
In fact, you're saying a very interesting thing. You're saying the government's response to that slogan about Bharat Tere Tukde Honge, which the government doesn't like, is actually such a short-sighted, dangerous response that they may end up creating the tukras they want to try and protect the country from becoming.
Absolutely. They may end up creating the tukras by alienating more people, by sending out the message that this is a country that is going to put individual citizens to litmus tests and presumptively distrusting its own citizens, right? Once you presumptively distrust your own citizens, the nation is already finished, in some ways, right? And the second and more, I think, equally important thing, which I do want to say, is that, look, At this point in India's history, our economic development matters a lot. This is what this government was elected to promote. By investing so much political capital in creating unnecessary social conflict, you have in a sense distracted the nation from what should be its core agenda, which is how do we secure a prosperous future for millions of young people.
Would you go a step further? Would you say that this government, by its recent behavior, although you could stretch that behavior back a year and a half, going back to the conversion campaigns and love jihad campaigns, would you say the government has actually lost the narrative? That they came to power with the vision, with an agenda, we invested in it by voting for them. They seem to have forgotten it. They've got hijacked by nationalism, anti-nationalism instead.
I actually think not only have they lost the agenda, the narrative, I mean, there is, to be fair to them, there is some interesting stuff happening on the economy, and particularly in the last 5 or 6 months, I think you can sense a little bit of administrative urgency. But they're scoring an own goal by not letting that narrative be up, sort of center and prominent. But I think they've lost the plot in the sense that they're displaying a sense of panic. I mean, frankly, if you ask the question, what is the need to do all of this right now, right? I think one interpretation is that their own analysis seems to suggest that they nearly do not have as much popularity and credibility as they did 2 years ago, and some of that loss is inevitable. But what you get is the impression that the government has kind of gone into a premature panic mode.
Let me put you, in fairness, two defenses that government ministers have made and get you to respond to them. Arun Jaitley says, and I think he was saying it specifically with JNU and Hyderabad University in mind, that what we've seen is a battle of ideologies. He claims the BJP has won it because students, he says, who were chanting what he called anti-national slogans came out of jail waving the flag and proclaiming Jai Hind. Right. How do you respond to that?
See, I do not for a moment doubt these students' patriotism. Even if they were saying something that was objectionable and excessive, it was born out of an anger and injustice. So the idea that you've got somebody to say Jai Hind and that is a victory for the nation, I would argue the other side of it is, think of how many students, a generation of students now that will distrust the state. Think of a generation of students you might possibly radicalize by convincing them that this is not a set of universities or a society where they're free to express what they want and even experiment a little bit. So I think it's a very myopic victory to say that just because we've got a bunch of people to say Jai Hind, that is actually what's going to make the nation great.
There's the second defense. This time it comes from Venkaiah Naidu, the Minister of Urban Development. He says that this was a sinister plot. He says the slogans were not meant to protest the death penalty, but a clear call for the disintegration of India. He's actually accusing those students of wanting to disintegrate the country. How do you reply to him?
So, first of all, what's the evidence that they actually are involved in any plot, any conspiracy? I mean, for anybody who's taught in any Indian university for 20 years, this kind of stuff is pretty common in student life, student politics. So, where's the evidence?
And the odd part is that both Venkaiah Naidu and Arun Jaitley were student politicians in that time.
They were student politicians, and they were imprisoned. But that's exactly the point, right? Which is, why has the government gone into a mode where it seems to project two sentiments so powerfully? One, that everything is a conspiracy. It's a telling sign whenever governments go into thinking that there is a conspiracy out to get them or out to get India, you can be pretty confident that they're losing the plot. And second, I think what the BJP has come back to is the playing victim syndrome, right? These are urban young voters that actually gave them the mandate in 2014. And yes, some of them are getting disenchanted. Some of them have voted for Aam Aadmi Party in the Delhi elections. Why do you suppose that these young people are part of this conspiracy to dismember India?
You also, in the section where you accuse the government of political stupidity, comment about the way they've built up the opposition. You say that the government has given the opposition exactly the pretext to unite that they need. Instead of capitalizing on a fractured opposition that was reduced to minuscule numbers of 44, the government is actually helping them regroup, become stronger, and become an opponent the government has problems handling.
Well, that is one part I do want to qualify. I think for a moment it looked like that, and certainly I think the more polarized Indian politics gets, it is more likely that the opposition will have to unite. But having said this, it is a great tragedy that the Congress party has shown no courage of conviction at all. I think Mr. Anand Sharma, for example, in Parliament, walked straight into Smriti Irani's trap, when she sort of gave that description of what this pamphlet supposedly said about Durga, which was exactly designed to tell the Congress party, you have never been a defender of free speech. In Maharashtra, on Bharat Mata Ki Jai, Congress party again walked into the trap. So the problem is the Congress has shown no courage of conviction in separating out two issues, which is where does it stand on issues of free speech. And let us not forget that a lot of the laws that the BJP has misused, were not just Congress creations, but Congress has shown no sign of breaking away from its own sordid past on free speech issues. That I do think is a tragedy.
So the BJP, as you said in February, had given the opposition an opportunity to unite, but now a month later your belief is that actually the opposition has squandered this opportunity. It hasn't risen to the occasion the BJP presented it with on a silver platter.
Absolutely, it has shown no courage of conviction at all.
What about specifically the role played in the last 6 weeks by Sonia Gandhi and Rahul Gandhi?
Well, so, Rahul Gandhi gave a couple of fiery speeches in Parliament. It looked like he was getting, as it were, some political passion back. But he has to do two things, and which the Congress party hasn't done. First, the Congress party has to admit that it has also made grievous mistakes in the past. After all, the misuse of sedition law was a Congress party invention. During the Kodakalam agitation, for example, hundreds of sedition cases were filed, right?
So an admission and an apology is necessary to be taken credibly.
Admission is necessary, and then say, we are going to commit to a new institutional and legal charter of freedom. Here are 4 bad laws that we either want to repeal or modify or build new safeguards for. The problem is they don't commit to any of those institutional positions, and they can't even get their own MLAs, as in Maharashtra, to actually say that, look, this particular MLA who doesn't want to say has a right to not say Bharat Mata Ki Jai.
In other words, fiery speeches by Rahul Gandhi occasionally in Parliament are simply not enough. Congress has to begin by admitting that the lapses the government is making today were lapses it made itself and created a precedent for. And then the Congress has to say, now, these are the issues, these are the laws, these are the positions we're going to change and give up forever.
Absolutely. And as a legal scholar once rightly said, that, one should look at not just what politicians say, but what they do and what they say. And that's not a test the Congress is passing yet.
Do you suspect that Congress, and perhaps specifically Rahul and Sonia Gandhi, lack either the courage and conviction, or perhaps even the honesty to introspect and say, we made mistakes, we correct them, whilst admitting our mistakes, we're also going to change and hold up the government to the high standards we're now adopting? Do they lack that courage, conviction and honesty?
I think both. I do think they lack the courage of conviction, which prevents them from clearly articulating their position in unequivocal terms and sticking to it with a degree of credibility and consistency. I also think in the Congress party, there is a mistaken narrative about what happened in 2014. Like the BJP, they also think that somehow, there was a conspiracy. This election was stolen from them, as if they had an entitlement to continue to rule. It was some kind of media, big capitalist conspiracy, and if only that conspiracy were to be exploded, their entitlement to rule would come back. So unless they honestly admit what was it that created a crisis of credibility by the Congress, they're not going to be able to move ahead.
In other words, they need to begin by being fundamentally honest about the predicament they're in themselves.
Absolutely.
Dr. Mehta, let's take a break at that point. When I come back, I want to widen the discussion and talk about what you called the toleration debate and the extent to which that has actually diminished and damaged the standing and image of the government. We'll be back in a moment's time. Stick with us. Welcome back. You're watching To The Point, and an exclusive interview with one of India's most profound political thinkers, the President for the Centre for Policy Research, Pratap Bhanu Mehtal. Let's at this point widen our discussion. You say, and I'm quoting you again, the toleration debate will overshadow everything else because the protection of freedom is the lifeblood of a democracy. Would you first agree that this toleration debate actually goes all the way back to the conversion campaigns of the winter of 2014, then the love jihad campaigns of early 2015, the award wapsi that we saw in the second half of 2015, then that entire focus on beef, and most recently, Hyderabad and Jawaharlal Nehru University. All of that, in a sense, is covered by that umbrella phrase, the tolerance debate.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, it's been slowly building up, and each time you think, right, that you have sort of hit the floor, as it were, or you expect that the BJP will respond positively or constructively to the civil society pushback on this curtailment of freedom, they actually find a new frontier in that war. And that cumulative pattern now suggests that it is foolish to expect or foolish to assume that what is going on here is an episodic lapse of judgment rather than, in a sense, a systematic ideological move to keep fighting on this front.
How much damage has all of this done to the standing and image of the BJP and the government in the country?
I think it has certainly done considerable damage to India's international standing. One thing Mr. Modi cares a good deal about. I mean, I think the international conversation on him has shifted. I think domestically, to be honest, it's hard to gauge. It's hard to gauge in the sense that you know, credibility is a kind of comparative game. And to the extent that the opposition has not been able to mobilize effectively, you could argue that it has probably not done them as much damage as it
saved
as
by
it
the
can.
opposition.
Saved by the opposition. But I do think it is diminishing their social capital to be able to negotiate the difficult social conflicts that lie ahead.
I want to focus a little on things that you said in 2014, just days before Mr. Modi took over, and how you view the government in contrast and comparison today. On the 24th of May 2014, you told me, and I'm quoting you, that the victory is an extraordinary opportunity to actually transform India for the better. Do you fear that in the almost 2 years since then, the government has frittered that extraordinary opportunity away?
I think it has fitted that extraordinary opportunity away. Look, it had an unprecedented historical mandate, and it just puzzles one to think why a government with such an unparalleled mandate is now playing as if it were the victim of some conspiracy. I think the focus of attention, I think a lot of political capital has gone into, in a sense, managing these tolerance and intolerance debates. And more importantly, I think what you are seeing, even in areas where there is some energy, like power, roads, is at best it has settled for incremental rather than transformative change.
Now you say something very pointedly about the BJP as a party. You say it's a party that cannot repress its own base instincts, whose petty politics of resentment will always subvert whatever long-term goals it might have. To me, that sounds not just criticism, to me that sounds like disillusionment.
There is this, look, I mean, I think, you know, there was a paradox, I think, with Mr. Modi's rise to power, which is certainly in 2014, it has to be said. I mean, he's an unprecedented political phenomenon with incredible political gifts. There is no doubt about that. But there seemed to be this moment where he also had acquired a sense of destiny, right? That's how he presented itself, as a kind of new Jawaharlal Nehru who could put India onto, in a sense, a different and better path. But that sense of destiny was in conflict with the party that he has inherited, and in a sense his own, as his word, background in the RSS, right? And one of the abiding features that I think is true of both his personality and I think the BJP, his party, is that they absolutely love seeing themselves as victims at every stage. And I think now that sense of victimhood, which diminishes you, is triumphing over that sense of destiny, which for a moment seemed to enlarge him and at least give him some possibility of change.
Has Mr. Modi shrunk in the 2 years he's been Prime Minister?
I think he has shrunk considerably. his evasive silences on most critical matters. Frankly, Manmohan Singh at least has an excuse. I don't think this Prime Minister has an excuse. And particularly when he is actually given to speaking quite eloquently. The fact that he can't handle a few errant ministers, the fact that you can't take action against a odd MLA, is suggesting either a level of abdication of the kind he accused Manmohan Singh of, or a degree of connivance with what's going on that diminishes him.
So you're disappointed, possibly even disillusioned with Mr. Modi?
Look, whether we are disappointed or disillusioned is relevant. Let's put it this way. He has brought the country to a situation where the risks of social conflict and frittering away the economic opportunities we have are growing. And I think that's the most important thing that matters.
You said he has brought the country to this situation.
He has brought because he still has the mandate, he still has the political authority. And frankly, the kind of dominance that he enjoys within the BJP, there is no excuse why he cannot reorient the political and public culture of BJP to a better and more generous and imaginative conception of India.
You're suggesting that reorientation and change is possible. How long will it be before it becomes too late and difficult?
Well, look, it is already too late in the sense that you've already increased the risks of making that harder for yourself. But look, it's still retrievable, provided you take drastic action in the next 2 or 3 months.
But time is running out.
Time is running out, and once we are closer to the election cycle in UP, I think it's going to be very difficult.
I'm going to end by quoting something else you said to me in that interview on the 24th of May 2014, because it wasn't just a caution and a warning, it turns out to have been incredibly prescient. You said, let's not deny the fact that Mr. Modi's victory seems to have empowered a bunch of forces, let's say a bunch of nasty people whose prejudices about Muslims and whose short-sighted views of Indian history pose a threat to the secular Indian fabric. That concern has grown fairly considerably in the 2 years since you said it.
It has grown considerably, and it's also taken a different direction which we didn't anticipate, which is what worries me. So look, we know the RSS's ideology, and at least the RSS is an organization, and in some respects it's one step forward, two steps back. But I think this government's acceptance of a lot of vigilantism in politics, where it uses, as it did, or at least as it turned a blind eye into in Patiala House, but within civil society, a whole range of actors who basically been given a signal that it is not only acceptable, we positively encourage you to not just troll people, but in a sense create a reign of intellectual intimidation for anybody who disagrees with you. We don't know where this is going to end. And the use of vigilantism, as we know from our history, you don't know what consequences it will unleash.
This is the great danger, and you said it once before, you're saying it again. Mr. Modi has either himself unleashed or he's allowed forces to be unleashed that are not just dangerous. We don't know where they lead us and in what outcome the whole thing will end.
He's certainly acting as if he's helpless, and I think that really diminishes him considerably. I have no position of knowing what his thinking is, what his intent is, but a prime minister has to be judged by his actions, not by his intentions. I think this is a sentiment he would agree with most of all.
And here his lack of actions is damning.
And his actions betray the promises he made to this country.
Pratap, Bhanu, Mehtal, you have been incredibly forceful and outspoken. A pleasure speaking to you.